Hola, ¿qué tal? ¿Cómo estás? Welcome to this lesson in the translation series. In this particular video, what I want to talk about are 8 specific Spanish grammar structures that are especially challenging when you're translating from English to Spanish, whether you're a Spanish language learner, a heritage speaker, or a native speaker. So the goal of this lesson is, with this knowledge that you're going to obtain, you'll be able to look at your source text and anticipate some of the speed bumps you might run into, know why they're difficult, and maybe have some strategies for dealing with them. All right, so in case you were wondering why this video, why are we going to talk about challenging grammar structures and translation? A few points to cover. Grammar forms and structures can present a special challenge for language learners, obviously, and for translation students and professionals. This is especially the case when the translator is translating into their second language. So if the target language, the language of the target text, is not my first language, grammar forms and structures are going to be more of a challenge. Now, some of these topics that I'm going to cover in this video are challenging even for native speakers of the target language. So if you're translating into Spanish, even if you're a native speaker or heritage speaker, much more so if you're a heritage speaker, some of these things can still throw you off. There's nothing worse than a false sense of security. So I think it's important for translators that we know what we don't know, or we know things that might be difficult for us. And of course, we're going to be looking at issues that are difficult when translating into Spanish. So everything I'm going to say in this presentation assumes English to Spanish directionality in translation. Even though I've already covered the importance of equivalence in these 3 different equivalence orientations in different videos, I want to just as a reminder, because we're going to be talking about formal equivalence, or using similar linguistic forms or structures. So obviously the goal of an effective translation is to produce a target text or a translation that has appropriate levels of equivalence to the source text in these 3 areas. The language forms attains formal equivalence. The same message, of course, that's always important, that the translation has cognitive equivalence, and to achieve the same effect on target language readers as the source text had on its readers, or dynamic equivalence. Now, so when we're talking about grammar or source language forms, and translating those into target language forms, we may be talking about the formal aspects or attaining formal equivalence. However, that term, formal equivalence, is a little bit deceiving, because it's not necessarily that we want the forms and structures in the target text to look exactly like those in the source text. That may or may not be possible. What we really want to do is produce an effective text. So what is translation again? Susan Bassnett has a definition that I really like, because it addresses both meaning and form and structure. So she says that translation involves the rendering of a source language text into the target language, so in this case an English text into Spanish, so as to ensure the meaning of the two will be similar, or the same I would say, and the structures, and here's where we get to grammar, the structures of the source language will be preserved as closely as possible. That's the idea of formal equivalence, but not so closely that the target language structures will be seriously distorted. So in Bassnett's idea of translation, you want to attain the highest degree of formal equivalence or structural grammatical equivalence as possible, but not to the point that your text is awkward or unidiomatic or unnatural in the target language. So I like her definition because she recognizes the importance of language structures. So source language structures often have corresponding structures in the target language. So there is a simple past in English. There is the preterito in Spanish. Or we have the ing forms, right, in English. And we have the ando, yendo forms in Spanish. But the fact that the target language has corresponding structures, that doesn't mean that these particular corresponding structures what we think of as corresponding structures are going to be the most effective to attain the appropriate balance of equivalences. And that's because different languages often have different ways of expressing the same content in the same register with the same tone. So again, it's that idea of, if we're attaining cognitive equivalence, same information, and dynamic equivalence, same effect, we may or may not end up with a target language text that looks a lot like, in terms of the structures used, the source language text. They might be different. So finally, after that sort of theoretical introduction, let's talk about what concerns us in this video. And I want to focus on 8 structures in the Spanish language. Spanish is our target language if we're going from English to Spanish. 8 Spanish that are, first of all, difficult for language learners whose target language is Spanish, but of course difficult for translators, especially beginning translators who are going from English to Spanish, particularly when Spanish is not their native language, but even for native speakers and in particular for heritage speakers, some of these target language structures can be challenging. So we're going to look at the ser, estar distinction, or expressing to be in Spanish, the preterite imperfect distinction, right? Different past tense aspect, passive voice, and other uses of the particle se. That little 2-word particle se has several uses, including the passive voice. We're going to talk about the subjunctive, prepositions, adjectives, in particular adjective placement, which can be tricky, articles, definite, indefinite articles, and there the dilemma is when to use them, when to omit them, and finally relative pronouns, those little words that introduce relative clauses. Now mind you, in this video I'm not going to teach these structures or even teach their uses. What I'm doing is, I like to call these the kind of the speed bumps, that if you're coming up on one of these structures and you think, oh my gosh, I might need the subjunctive here, or obviously I need a preposition, where should I put the adjective? Do I need el, la, los, las, un? These are like speed bumps. You need to slow down, pump the brakes, and really pay attention. But I'm not going to teach necessarily all the forms and uses of these 8 structures. I'm more than anything, I'm pointing them out as things to be aware of. So again, this is just a slide, sort of a graphic representation of that idea, right? That the 8 structures I just mentioned on the previous slide are things that give us pause, especially when Spanish, the target language, is not our native language. So if we're a non-native speaker, we have all these speed bumps. We look down the road and we see a bunch of speed bumps. If we're a native speaker, maybe the speed bumps are a little bit easier to handle. All right, let's look at the first problematic structure. And again, more than anything in this video, what I want to do is throw up the signs, right? Los letreros, right? The signs on the roadway, so that you know, oh, this issue happens to be a speed bump. I need to be careful. I don't have time to teach all the forms and uses of these different structures. So I'm going to point out what the problem is. So when it comes to expressing equivalence of to be, is, was, are, right? The problem is that Spanish has several ways to express all these forms, is, are, was, were, etc. So you have the verb ser, as in nosotros somos traductores. You have obviously the verb estar. La intérprete estaba cansada. You have haber, which can also mean there is, there are. Hubo muchas dificultades. And in many cases, tener. So the equivalent for to be could be tener. Todos tenemos hambre. The English equivalent there would be we are all hungry. So to be, expressing to be in Spanish is our first speed bump because there are at least 4 different forms. Another structure that represents a speed bump, something that we need to be aware of as a difficulty, we need to pump the brakes, whether we're a language learner, a heritage speaker, or a native speaker, is expressing the past going from English to Spanish. Here's the problem. When narrating past actions or describing past conditions, accounting for aspect, should it be preterite, imperfect, can be challenging. Okay, and there's a couple of reasons, because first of all, we have to choose the appropriate tense to reflect the aspect of that verb. Is it a completed action, or is it an action whose completion, beginning, end is not quite perceptible, right? So do we use the preterite or the imperfect? So that's one complication. A second speed bump, don't you hate it when there's 2 in a row, is that we have to come up with the appropriate form. So we may know, oh, here the proper form, the proper tense would be the preterite. but you still have to get the form right. So that's a second speed bump. So again, expressing the past tense and making those distinctions for aspect, preterite, imperfect in the proper form can be a challenging speed bump for translation from English to Spanish. The third topic that is a definite speed bump, a cause of many troubles, has to do with uses of the particle se. The problem is that aside from its use in passive voice constructions, se has a lot of other tricky uses. You have the se passive constructions like los documentos se enviarán la semana entrante, los documentos se enviarán la semana entrante, where the subject of the sentence is los documentos. You have the se in reflexive and reciprocal constructions. For example, los abogados se encontraron ayer. You have se as an indirect object pronoun. Se lo voy a entregar. Se lo voy a entregar. One mistake that a lot of native speakers make, say we're talking about the documents. We're talking about the documents. They would say, se los voy a entregar. Se los voy a entregar, right? But many times, if the indirect object is plural, but the direct object is singular, like el documento, it should be se lo voy a entregar a ustedes. But many native speakers make the mistake of saying se los voy a entregar. So that's just one example where native and heritage speakers have some issues that they have to work through in their written and spoken language. The impersonal se cree que, or se come bien en España. The no-fault se, right, that people like to call this the no-fault se, se nos ha escapado o se les había acabado. So that little particle se has so many uses that are so different, and some of them are actually very similar, that it can be confusing for language learners, but also for native speakers. So definitely the use of se is a speed bump going from English to Spanish. Another speed bump or difficulty that's very well known and documented for English speakers or speakers of any language other than Spanish who are learning Spanish as their second language is the use and the forms of the subjunctive. The problem is, if you're going from English to Spanish, because the subjunctive mood is often not marked in English, it does exist. English has the subjunctive, but it's often not marked as clearly as it is in Spanish. Because of that, knowing when it's required or which tense and form to use can be challenging. Okay? This is because, for a couple different reasons, use of the subjunctive requires a very specific syntactic structure. You need to have main clause, a subordinate clause with different subjects in each clause. That's number one. And then there's a semantic component as well. The subjunctive's only used to communicate certain kinds of meaning. So volition, doubt, uncertainty, right? Persuasion, negation, emotion. It's also used when we're talking about indefinite qualities or unrealized actions. So that's the semantic part that can be a little bit difficult for people to understand. And then finally, when using the subjunctive, there's a very rigid sequence of tenses. So for example, if our main clause verb is in the past, our dependent clause verb also must be in the past. And here's an area where in some dialects it's used incorrectly. So it's another area where native speakers might have trouble. So if, for example, you're wanting to translate, he asked me to call him, you would say, me pidió que lo llamara. It's ungrammatical to say, me pidió que lo llame, which in some dialects is at least idiomatic. So that's that sequence of tenses. So for many reasons, right, mostly knowing when to use it and then coming up with the correct form, the subjunctive is a very big series of speed bumps when you're translating into Spanish. Another category that causes a lot of difficulty for learners of Spanish, but also I've noticed in native speakers who may have lived in the United States or another English-speaking country for a long time, is uncertainty about when a preposition is needed and which preposition to use when you're going from English to Spanish. So that's the problem. Since the use of prepositions varies from one language to another, choosing equivalence in the target language can be challenging. Okay? So it's complicated because sometimes prepositions seem to correspond directly. So you say, okay, in is en, On is en. With is con, right? A is to, etc. De is of or from. But that's only true part of the time if you look at the way prepositions are actually used. Prepositions, that's because prepositions usually have more uses than just their direct translation, right? So for example, por and para, we're taught that they're both equivalents for in English, and that we have to choose if we're trying to translate the idea of for, we have to choose between por and para. But por and para are the equivalents of several other prepositions in English, such as by, alongside, to, right, on behalf of, etc. We also need to know that certain verbs may require specific prepositions, and that these prepositions might be different from language to language. Different in the sense that they're not the preposition you would expect in a direct translation. So for example, one very obvious example is in English we say to dream about, and in Spanish we say soñar con. All right, and then a fourth complicating factor is that the need to use a preposition at all may vary across languages. So for example, in English we say to look for, and in Spanish we don't say buscar por. In English we say to wait for, and under the prescriptive rules of Spanish we don't say esperar por. Estaba esperando por ti. In some uses it might be okay, but certainly not in a written translation. So this is kind of frustrating, but mastery of preposition usage across languages takes many years. There are some second language learners of Spanish that even after 20 years of being fairly proficient will still make sporadic mistakes using translations or using prepositions in translations. I put adjective placement on our list of speed bumps, things to slow down, pump the brakes, and maybe get some help, because correctly predicting adjective placement is often more complicated than we've been led to believe. We've been taught many times that in Spanish, right, adjectives follow the nouns they modify, but that's not necessarily true. They usually do. We usually say, es una persona agradable, or fue un evento muy concurrido, but that's not always the case. Many times, adjectives come before or precede the nouns that they modify. Una excelente forma de invertir, un enorme desafío, right? And there are many, many examples. So again, in this video, I'm not going to explain why or when or give you any rules. I'm just pointing out this is a speed bump, something to be very careful about using when you're translating into Spanish. Adjective placement. Article usage. Why article usage? We're talking about words for the, okay? Direct article or definite articles, indefinite articles, a, an, some. These are some of the first words we learn in a Spanish 101 class. What's so difficult about these? Well, it turns out, much like preposition, there may be many hard to predict discrepancies between article usage, definite and indefinite, between Spanish and English. The rules or patterns of definite article usage in English and Spanish are almost impossible to summarize. I've never seen a satisfactory or thorough explanation of when to use an article, when to omit an article, going from English to Spanish or from Spanish to English. So, as with prepositions, mastery of article usage, when to use them, when to omit them, takes many, many years of experience, practice, and exposure. I guess I should say exposure, practice, experience. So it's definitely a speed bump, kind of like a landmine, actually. The final topic that we're going to look about in terms of speed bumps or problematic grammar structures in Spanish is one that a lot of people don't think about very often, but is used very much, and those are relative pronouns. These are the words, usually que and quien, that introduce a relative clause, which is a clause that modifies some antecedent, a noun in the previous clause. The problem is that predicting which relative pronouns introduce those relative clauses in Spanish creates a lot of uncertainty for non-native speakers. And also native speakers make many mistakes with relative pronouns. Again, this is not a big deal if heritage or native speakers are making mistakes in spoken language, but it is a big deal when those mistakes carry over to formal written languages that we handle in translation. So, what are relative pronouns? Well, we have the simple forms like que, la reunión que tuvimos ayer, o el director que votó en contra, and quién, which is often misused. Just to give you a quick example, a lot of people think that the rule is that you use quién whenever the antecedent is a person. So they might say, el director quien votó en contra, especially when they're trying to be careful. There's a phenomenon known as hypercorrection, but you don't use quién in that syntactic structure. El director que votó en contra, even though it's a person. So there are many complicating factors. You also have, many times in written language, more formal texts, the compound forms. So, right, la reunión sobre la cual conversamos ayer, or el director para quien, or para el cual, right, trabajamos. So native speakers struggle less with this, but there are errors of register and degree of formality and punctuation that are still possible. So it's definitely a speed bump for everyone. Okay, so I've shared with you 8 structures in Spanish, in the Spanish grammar system, that I think are problematic, especially for second language learners of Spanish translating into Spanish, but can also give heritage speakers and native speakers some trouble from time to time. What I want to do is finish up with just some final thoughts, maybe some strategies. So when you come across, you think you might need to use one of these structures, ser, estar, preterito, imperfecto, one of the relative pronouns, an article, a preposition, okay? You need to recognize that that's a speed bump. That's a landmine. You need to slow down. If you're a native speaker or a heritage speaker, I would say, trust your instincts. Stay on the road. Proceed with caution. However, if you're a non-native speaker, if you're an L2 learner of Spanish who's translating into Spanish, I would say, stop, get off the road, pull over, think it through. Use a resource to find a solution. Use something like word reference or lingua.com, or ask a sophisticated native speaker what the appropriate form would be. Remember to consider non-literal approaches. What I mean by that is, don't think necessarily, what I mentioned earlier in the presentation, that sometimes the most appropriate grammar structure in Spanish is not the parallel structure in English. So don't be afraid to be creative. If you have a hunch, and especially if you're a non-native speaker, if you think, I think here I need an article, I need to say el doctor, I need to say el profesor, or un profesor, or in this case I don't need to. Be sure to check that hunch. You can ask a linguistically sophisticated native speaker. Don't ask any native speaker or any heritage speaker, because 90% of native speakers of a language, whether it's English, Spanish, French, Portuguese, whatever, they don't know the prescriptive rules for their language. You need to ask someone who's a teacher, a professor, a translator, an interpreter, somebody that works with language every single day. Don't ask your roommate. Don't ask the native speaker you know from the Mexican restaurant. Ask a linguistically sophisticated person that works with language, if your choice is correct, or use a reliable, authentic online source to verify your choice. So those are some tips on how to deal with those linguistic speed bumps. Hopefully this lesson's been helpful, just pointing them out, and you'll be more aware. You'll know what you might not know.